Hey everybody, I know I've said it before on this trip. I just can't believe it. Here I am at another place I've never been, and this is a good one. This is Confederate Fort Anderson. It is in an incredible state of preservation. It's huge. I thought Fort McAllister was really cool, but A, it's reconstructed, and B, it's not even as large or well preserved as this one. So I'm really glad to be here, and we'll be talking about that in a second. But let me bring us up to speed. In late 1864 and into early 1865, you've seen the videos already. The Union is going to make attempts and eventually capture Confederate Fort Fisher. After they capture Fort Fisher, they're not at Wilmington yet, so there's going to be, an attempt to move upon Wilmington, right? And just to put this into perspective here, that's the Cape Fear River. Beyond that is a spit of land. Beyond that is the Atlantic Ocean, if I'm pointing roughly in the right direction. And then here we are at Fort Anderson here. The Union first tries to go up on the other side of the Cape Fear River. That results in part in the Battle of Sugarloaf. You may have seen the video for that already. So the Union says, forget that, let's go to the other side where we have more room to maneuver on the mainland. And they're going to try to come and over to this side here, and we're going to talk about that. For the Confederate side, just note that it's Cape Fear River, Fort Anderson. Then they have some sand fortifications leading to a pond called Orton's Pond. And to talk about all this is going to be our friend, you've already seen him, Chris Fonvielle. He knows all about these areas. But before we get into the fighting, Chris, where are we standing? Why is it called what it is? What do we need to know about Fort Anderson?
Okay, well, we're standing on the parapet of Fort Anderson, which was begun in 1862. It is a massive earthen fortification built along the same character as Fort Fisher. But unlike Fort Fisher, which is only about 25% extant, 95% of Fort Anderson is still here. It's an incredibly well-preserved fortification. In fact, the late, great Ed Bars called Fort Anderson the nicest preserved earthen fortification that he had ever visited and toured. So Fort Anderson was begun in March of 1862. The idea is that it would protect the water approaches to Wilmington in case enemy forces ever breached Wilmington Harbor at the mouth of the river, at Old Inlet or New Inlet, as they would after capturing Fort Fisher. But then, as we talked about, they set their sights on capturing Wilmington to support General Sherman's Northern Expedition or Carolinas campaign, to capture Wilmington for the river and the three railroads for resupplying and reinforcing Sherman if he could make it to North Carolina. So the last major obstacle between those forces that captured Fort Fisher and Wilmington in February of 1865 was Fort Anderson. Initially called Fort St. Philip's in honor of the English Anglican Church that was a part of the colonial town of Brunswick. And really, we're at a dual historic site. This was the leading seaport on the Cape Fear River between the mid-1720s and after the American Revolution, to be supplanted by Wilmington, which is 14 miles further up the Cape Fear River, but was largely abandoned after the Revolutionary War. And then in the spring of 1862, Confederate engineers will come here and build massive Fort Anderson, originally named in honor of the church that bore witness to that first war for independence. And as far as Southerners were concerned, now they are fighting a second war for independence. So it's Fort St. Philip, but in 1863 they rename it Fort Anderson for Brigadier General George Burgoyne Anderson, who was mortally wounded at the Battle of Sharpsburg, Battle of Antietam in September of 1862.
Good. Thank you. And many of you have been there. He is mortally wounded right along the Bloody Lane. It's his North Carolinians next to the Alabamians of Robert Rhodes who are going to begin falling back after they are flanked. So what's going to happen is we have this fort, and what we're going to have is, the Union commander, a guy you've heard of with a long, cool beard named Schofield, is going to eventually dispatch a guy you've also heard of from Antietam, from Burnside Bridge, I don't know, fame or infame, not Burnside himself, but Jacob D. Cox. He was at Franklin, he's at Antietam, and now here he is at Fort Anderson.
General Grant was remember, he was indifferent to the first attack on Fort Fisher, mightily interested in the second attack to capture Wilmington in support of Sherman's Northern Expedition, as he called it. After the fall of Fort Fisher, Grant was so determined to capture Wilmington, and in this 4 years long bloody war, that he came to the Cape Fear on January the 28th to consult with Admiral Porter, whose naval task force had bombarded Fort Fisher in the two largest naval bombardments of the war, and with Alfred Terry, whose expeditionary force had captured Fort Fisher. And after a month of reconnoitering the Confederate defenses along the Cape Fear River, including Fort Anderson, Porter and Terry said, General Grant, we've got one major obstacle in front of us, and that's Fort Anderson. But we believe that we can capture it, and then the way to Wilmington will be easy. With Grant on that trip was John McAllister Schofield, whose corps had fought at Franklin, been in Tennessee, transferred to Alexandria. Grant then planned to transfer the corps down to Georgia to join Sherman's 60,000-man legion for the Carolinas campaign, but instead he decided to send Schofield to the Cape Fear to make sure that Wilmington was captured. And before he left, after hearing about the attack on Wilmington by way of Fort Anderson, Grant said, good, it is the best and only thing to be done. Attack Wilmington by way of Fort Anderson. So Schofield will arrive in early February with one division of his corps, led by Major General Jacob D. Cox. And after attempting to overrun Sugarloaf and then outflank Sugarloaf in mid-February of 65, on the 16th, Schofield will transfer Cox's division over to the west side of the Cape Fear River to advance against Fort Anderson. In Cox's division will be about 6,500 troops in 4 brigades, and they will move up the Cape Fear River on the 17th, with most of the heavy ground fighting occurring here at Fort Anderson on February the 18th, while Admiral Porter's flotilla of gunboats, including the ironclad Monitor Montauk, will bombard the fort from the riverside.
Good, and let's start to move off in this direction. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. We are at Confederate Fort Anderson. We're here with Chris Fonvielle. We might have one more guest ahead of us, and we're walking toward the direction in which the Union troops, which Cox's 4 brigades, are coming. We're not going to eventually have all 4 Confederate Union brigades under Cox coming this way, and we're going to get into that in a second. For now, let's have a moment of zen while we safely pick our way down the gun emplacement here, and we'll be back with you in a sec.
Okay, that was tighter. And I got the Antietam right here. Which we say such a...
So, we're about to visit with another friend real quick, but before we get there, is there anything, we don't want to talk about the fighting quite yet, but we're going to go up this way here. Is there anything you want to say about the fort in this area here? What did it look like more at the time? Was there a lot of wood here?
Well, it looked essentially like it looks now. I mean, this fort is so well preserved. We're in the parade ground, but notice how high and massive these earthworks are. I mean, they're 24 feet above ground. And like Fort Fisher, the ramparts are separated by gun chambers, and traverses separate the gun compartments, underneath which are bomb proofs and 1 gunpowder magazine. But this is an extremely well preserved earthen fortification.
Good, and I'll bet you he can already hear me, because I'm told that I project. But we're about to meet up with Jim McKee, who is standing in another part of the fort. Jim McKee is, I think, by my calculation, the 4th North Carolina Historic Site Manager that we've met. He's the site manager here at Fort Anderson. And there's Jim up there. We're going to meet him in a second, I think, and we'll see what he has to say. What do you got, Jim?
This is part of the original gun platform. After the war, salvors came in here and burned everything up just to get to the iron. And this is part of the original platform.
Incredible.
We had to do lots of archaeology in this gun emplacement to be able to rebuild this and make sure that it was accurate in every way.
Yeah, and remember, archaeology, that's officially sanctioned archaeology. Don't be coming out here looking for it yourself.
Yeah, please don't. That's a no-no.
What's special about this part of the fort? Is this like most other forts?
Well, it is, but it isn't. There's a few features in this fort that are different from everywhere else. One of the unique features of this fort, and one of the reasons why it's remained so long, is the bottom third of this fort is basically carved out of the living earth. So this gun platform that we're sitting on would have been the original ground level. So if you look back where we've walked all out in the town, that was the original ground level. So they literally just staked this out, carved out what they needed, and then dug out around to build up the rest of the traverses and the parapet. Also, the parapet walls on this battery, most of them had half embrasures, meaning the right side of the parapet was built up, but that's not done until January or early February of 1865. The purpose of that half embrasure, granted it takes out half the gun's arc, but it gives the crews 75% more protection. And the reason for that was the Union Navy, most of their guns outranged Fort Anderson's 32-pounders. So as a result, there was no need for those guns to aim any further south because the Navy was sitting out of range. Once these guns were aimed straight out, if they saw the bow of a ship, they were in range and they could open fire.
I mean, you know, I think a lot of people have this idea that these are just big mounds of earth. No, these are engineering miracles, and they're what you would do. If you had an enemy in front of you and you had a cannon poking out, you would put the ground up on both sides, and then you would say, hey, wait, guns are coming on this way. Let me build something. A traverse that's going to protect me while we're fighting in this way, and give me a fortification if I need to turn off in that direction. We might put up headlogs. We might put up other things to preserve life and minimize your casualties while maximizing those of the enemy. Guys, anything to add before we walk down toward the old town as well?
Well, just, on board those warships were 9-inch, 11-inch Dahlgren guns. The Monitor Montauk, which was part of the flotilla, had a 15-inch gun. So the range of those cannons was more than 2 miles with considerable accuracy. Whereas here at Fort Anderson were basically cast-off Seacoast guns, mostly smoothbore 32-pounders that had a range of a mile, maybe a mile and a quarter. So the Union flotilla could bombard this fort from much further distances, and the fort really could not respond. In fact, Johnson Haygood said, we responded to the fire of the fleet just more in defiance than with any hope of causing any real damage to the warships themselves.
Yeah, the only warship that really stayed in range during the entire bombardment or the entire action was USS Montauk, which was a Passaic-class monitor. And yes, the fort rung her bell a few times, but because she's armored, they couldn't penetrate.
Yeah, and a Confederate soldier said it was like shooting a pop gun off of a brick wall.
And let me ask you all, what comes to mind when you hear of the USS Montauk? What sort of May 1865 thing, or even April 1865 thing, might you think of when you think of the USS Montauk? We won't say it. Put it in the comments, and we'll see from there. Now, we do want to do some walking, but this is a good time to actually introduce this. Where we left the fighting last time, we had Jacob D. Cox's 4 brigades coming up this way toward Fort Anderson, but he's going to somehow learn that maybe this isn't the best way to come in, that maybe the back of the fort is open. Chris?
Yeah, like Fort Fisher, this is just a 2-sided work. And from a bird's eye view, again, it's shaped kind of like a number 7. So the rear of the fort is open. But the Confederates didn't have the manpower or the resources to make this a full bastion. Perhaps they were working towards that end, but when the attack came in February of 1865, it was what it was. It was a 2-sided work. The engineers used the freshwater ponds. The infantry curtain that begins at about St. Philip's Church, which you'll see in just a few moments, then extends for about 1.25 miles all the way out to Orton Pond. So the engineers use low ground, known as Carolina Bays, freshwater ponds, and Orton Pond, which is really a lake 5 miles long, is sort of natural defenses. So even though the fort from the Cape Fear River, where we started, all the way up to Orton Pond runs for more than a mile, because of Orton Pond, you've really got a defensive structure that extends about 6 miles. So going out around Orton Pond to outflank the forts is going to take a considerable effort. But as Cox is reconnoitering the fort and determining how his troops are going to capture the fort while the fort is being bombarded by Porter's Naval Task Force, an African-American local man shows up, his name is Lem Brown, and said, well, the fort is open in the rear. There's a road south of Orton Pond. I'll guide you, and we can outflank the fort going that way. Now, that's a 10-mile detour there and back, but that was going to be much less bloody than attacking the fort head-on, which would have been almost suicidal. They could not have overrun the fort in this area. So that's what would happen. Two of Cox's brigades would demonstrate throughout the afternoon of February 18th, feigning an attack, a frontal assault on the fort, while his other two brigades are led by this African-American man to the headwaters of Orton Pond, and then they position themselves in the rear of the fort late that night. And by then, Johnson Haygood, the Confederate commander here, realizes that his command is in trouble.
Good. Let's keep walking a little bit. That's great. What a story. And even as we walk, let's go over to the steps here. But just think about this. U.S. Grant is personally interested in this movement. He's sending experienced soldiers, Schofield, Cox, to deal with it. Here's Cox alone on the other side of the river practically. He's got his 4 brigades, and an African American comes up. And they're going to put into his hands the movement of thousands of soldiers that might slow down the movement for hours, days, and it may or may not work. But who are you going to trust? Late war, with slavery and freedom in the balance, will you trust an African-American man who comes into you to give you this information, who appears to know what's going on? The answer is absolutely. Cox follows that advice, puts him in a perfect position behind the fort, and that'll be the end of Fort Anderson. Is that right, guys?
That's right.
Okay, good. Well, let's also, we've got more to talk about, but let me ask you if there's anything more to tie up with the fighting, because I know there's another fight up at a place called Forks Road. But also we have to talk about historic Brunswick Town, because I think we're going to walk by some of that. Whomever.
Yes, most of the fighting, as I mentioned, would occur on February the 18th. By the early morning hours of February the 19th, you've got 2 brigades of Union troops positioned in the rear of Fort Anderson that are preparing to attack the fort at dawn. You've got 2 brigades in front of the fort that have been engaging the garrison throughout the afternoon of the 18th. You've got Admiral Porter's flotilla of vessels, including the ironclad Monitor Montauk. So they're in a good position. Haygood's position is untenable. He telegraphs General Hoke at Sugarloaf, his headquarters over there, where there are 3 brigades of troops. They have managed to halt the Union juggernaut at the Battle of Sugarloaf, but Hoke does not want to abandon Fort Anderson unless absolutely necessary. He's been instructed by his commanding officer, General Braxton Bragg, hold all positions, period, so that Wilmington can be held in Confederate hands. But now with Haygood's garrison threatened by these Union forces, Hoke has little choice but to abandon Fort Anderson. But that also means he's going to have to abandon Sugarloaf, because Porter's flotilla is going to be able to ascend the Cape Fear River above Sugarloaf and bombard it from the rear, or land Marines or even transport troops from the west side back to the east side to attack it from the north. And so that means he's got to abandon Sugarloaf at the same time, and he does.
Very cool. So here we are. I'm seeing some ruins here. I assume this is part of historic Brunswick. So we have, again, it's a twofer here. We've got a Civil War battle. We have a much older community than that, Jim.
It is. What we're looking at here is the ruins of what has been interpreted as the first New Hanover County and the first Brunswick County courthouse. It was knocked down. It was built somewhere, we believe, in the 1730s. Knocked down in a hurricane around 1769. But the whole town is littered with, or the whole area is littered with ruins. As a matter of fact, the Confederates, when they were building Fort Anderson, were ordered to go out into the ruins of the town and collect brick and rock to bring back into the fort so they could build their barracks, their warehouses, and whatnot for the fort. So it's all reused.
This is just great, Jim. So come on out to Jim's site. Come out to North Carolina's site. Come on out to your site. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure you join us up while we tie up this fight for Wilmington at Forks Road, and make sure you buy Chris's book. What about
I think this is the definitive history of the Battle of Fort Anderson, called To Forge a Thunderbolt, Fort Anderson, the Battle for Wilmington, by Chris Fonvielle Jr. You can order this off of my website, www.chrisfonvielle.com, or from the Brunswick Town Fort Anderson State Historic Site gift shop.
Good.
And this is the book to have on Fort Anderson.
All right, well, we've got Chris for one more thing here, but so after you support battlefield preservation and after you support battlefield education, make sure you buy Chris's book about Fort Anderson. Something else to add, Jim?
We're good. Come on out and visit us. We'd love to have you. We have a lot to offer. Give us 2 hours, we'll give you 2 centuries.
I can't top that. Thank you for watching.